Hey there, guys. This is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review. Today, I'm going to be starting a movie review series. This is the first installment in a 4-movie action franchise, and today we are kicking off the Expendables review series. And today, of course, I'm going to be reviewing the Expendables from 2010, starring Sylvester Stallone, Jason Statham, Jet Li, Dolph Lundgren, Randy Couture, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Terry Crews, Mickey Rourke, and Bruce Willis. So, what is the plot to The Expendables from 2010? Well, the plot of the movie is as follows. A group of mercenaries is double-crossed during a mission and are approached by Church, played by Bruce Willis, to overthrow a ruthless dictator of a South American country. It isn't long before the men realize things aren't quite as they appear, finding themselves caught in a dangerous web of betrayal. Although their mission is compromised and an innocent is in danger, soldier of fortune Barney Ross, played by Sylvester Stallone, and his comrades decide to get the job done. So that's basically the plot synopsis to the movie. And how was the movie received? Well, when The Expendables was released in 2010, it got mixed reviews from critics, but it got a lot of positive reviews from audiences and it got a lot of positive reviews from audiences, and it was a smash hit at the box office, making $274.5 million worldwide on an $80 million budget. And the movie was so big that it spawned a 4-movie franchise. And I do like the first 2 movies. Not a fan of 3, and I haven't seen 4 yet, but I'll get to 4 when I eventually review that. But as for my reaction to the movie, as a fan of a lot of the actors involved with this movie, I really like this movie, and I do think that this is still the best movie in the whole franchise, all these years later. So without further ado, let's get into my review. The movie starts off on the ocean with a large ship full of hostages that these bad guys, aka pirates, plan to kill. Plus, the bad guys are filming, plus one of the pirates is actually filming it on camera, making a threat. And about 4 minutes and 30 seconds into the movie, one of the bad guys stops talking as Barney Ross and his team point laser guns at this bad guy, and Barney says, "There's your money, release the hostages." The bad guy then says, "How much is in there?" And then Barney Ross says to him, $3 million. The bad guy then says, "Too late. We want $5 million, eh?" And then I love the part when Lee Christmas, played by Jason Statham, says, "What do you know? A greedy pirate." Barney Ross then says, "Last chance. Take it or leave it." And the pirate then yells, "We want our money now," at the top of his lungs. And then Gunnar Jensen, the character played by Dolph Lundgren, yells, "Warning shot," and he basically shoots the main pirate's He basically shoots the main pirate, blowing his body in half in a rather gruesome but rather well done action scene. And then all the pirates start shooting at Barney Ross and his team, and now Barney Ross, played by Sylvester Stallone, and his team must take down these pirates. And I will say, this is a very good action scene in the movie. I especially love the scene when Barney Ross shoots 4 bad guys down at once. That right there was a pretty epic scene. And Barney Ross says to Gunnar, "What are you doing?" And then Gunnar says, "Hating a pirate." And then the character by the name of Yin Yan, played by the legendary Jet Li, says, "This is no good." And then Barney Ross says to Gunnar, "This is not how we work. Let him go." And then Gunnar, played by Dolph Lundgren, says to Barney Ross, played by Sylvester Stallone, "Why? He would do it to us." And then Barney says to him, "Gunnar, last chance. Let him go, or we are letting you go." And then I like the part when Gunnar says, "It's good to hang pirates." And then the character Yin Yan, played by Jet Li, tries to fight the character Gunnar, played by Dolph Lundgren, to basically make him stop, but Gunner pins him on the edge of the ship, holding a knife up to his throat. Barney Ross then points a gun at Gunnar Jensen's head and says, "Let him go, Gunner." And Gunner then says, "My partner kicked me with steel-toed shoes. Can you believe it?" And then Barney Ross says, "You deserve it." And then Gunner says, "I think I'll need stitches." And Gunner decides to let Yin Yan go, as requested, and Barney Ross and his team basically fly away in a helicopter. And then we cut to a scene where Lee Christmas, the character played by Jason Statham, arrives home to his girlfriend. However, it is revealed his girlfriend is a cheater and has a new boyfriend, so Lee Christmas leaves on a motorcycle, reasonably so. We are then introduced to a character by the name of Tool, who is actually played by Mickey Rourke, who is a very close friend to Barney Ross and is a part of the Expendables team. And funny enough, when this movie came out, it came out in 2010, the same year that Mickey Rourke played the bad guy in Iron Man 2. So, yeah, pretty good. 2010 was a pretty good year for Mickey Rourke, but this obviously being the better of the two movies. And I do own the Expendables in like this 3-movie DVD collection. And basically, the character Tool, played by Mickey Rourke, he does the tattoos on Barney Ross's back. And he's basically a tattoo shop businessman. And one thing I will say that I did really like about this character... one thing I really liked about this movie was the characters... was the main team itself, the Expendables team themselves. Barney Ross, played by Sylvester Stallone, Lee Christmas, played by Jason Statham, Yin Yan, played by Jet Li, Gunnar Jensen, played by Dolph Lundgren, Tool Road, played by Randy Couture, Hail Caesar, played by Terry Crews, Tool, played by Mickey Rourke, and of course, Mr. Church, played by Bruce Willis. All of these characters are great characters, played wonderfully by the cast, and you definitely buy their chemistry as members of the team. And then, 17 minutes into the movie, we cut to the island of Vilena in New Mexico, where a group of terrorists, one of them in particular, is about to shoot a hostage, but they stop as our main villain of the movie, James Monroe, played by Eric Roberts, shoots the hostage. And then we cut to a scene where James says to the general, because the general, because the bad guy, the general was going to be one of the ones to shoot the hostages, but then James Monroe basically says to the general, he wasn't stealing from you. He was stealing from both of us. And then he walks away, and then that bad guy and, the general ends up shooting the other two hostages. We then cut to a scene with Barney Ross and Mr. Church, and Mr. Church is played by Bruce Willis, and Mr. Church, played by Bruce Willis, basically says to Barney Ross, "Let's get down to business. Let's get down to business. Let's see who's hungry. I know your real name is probably not Barney Ross. You don't need to know my name. All you need to know is that the job is real and the money is real. But since we're in this nice place, you might as well call me Mr. Church." And then we are introduced to Trench, played by the legendary Arnold Schwarzenegger, who him and Barney Ross are friends and enemies at the same time. And Mr. Church says, "There's resources on Island Vilena that my people are very interested in." And then Trench, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, says, "But a general by the name of Guzara has overthrown the government." And Mr. Church, played by Bruce Willis, says, he basically says he wants Garaza, basically wants the general dead. So, Barney Ross agrees to the mission. And 23 minutes into the movie, Gunner shows back up, to talk to Barney Ross. And Gunner, played by Dolph Lundgren, says, "Don't replace me. I'm still good." And then Barney Ross but then of course Barney Ross isn't listening to what he says, and Barney Ross proceeds to fire Gunner and the reason he decides to fire Gunner is because Gunner he's basically been abusing drugs, and he says, "I can't trust you, Gunner." And Gunner ends up leaving as he's fired, which is pretty much why he's absent throughout most of the movie. And 26 into the movie, Barney Ross and Lee Christmas fly to Valina Island and carry fake IDs claiming they're there to photograph exotic birds. And 31 minutes into the movie, we are introduced to a character by the name of Sandra who tells Barney and Lee Christmas to follow her. She then drives them in a truck. And almost 37 minutes into the movie, after Lee Christmas basically left, to go, but still staying on the island, but he left because he had to go do something important. Basically, terrorists surround Sandra. Well, basically, terrorists that are who work for the general and the main bad guy of the movie surround Sandra and Barney Ross. And Sandra is the general's daughter. And one of the bad guys says, "Even the general's daughter can be shot." And then Sandra says, "You don't owe me." Then that terrorist orders his men to bring Sandra to her father, and Sandra's father is General Garraza. And Barney Ross tries to rescue her, but he is stopped when one of the terrorists knocks him to the ground and points a gun at him. But then we get to an epic action scene where Lee Christmas, played by Jason Statham, he shows up throwing a knife into the bad guy's head, and both Lee Christmas and Barney Ross fight the bad guys, and Sandra starts to run to safety. And I will say, that is a very good action scene where they take on at least 10 men. And I think that the action scenes are rather well directed in this movie. And Sylvester Stallone himself, who plays the main character, Barney Ross, the leader of the team, he actually directed this movie himself. So that's pretty cool. And I like the part when I like the whole action scene where Lee Christmas throws a knife into the bad guy's head. And then, like I said, him and Barney Ross start to fight the bad guys, and Sandra starts to run to safety. And then Sandra is saved where Barney Ross rescues Lee and Sandra by throwing a knife into the last bad guy's head. And then they get away from the bad guys in a car chase. And as soon as they're done doing that, Lee Christmas and Barney Ross are at the getaway plane that they were in. And Lee Christmas tries to get Sandra to go on the airplane, but Sandra says, "I belong here. I'm not getting on. Go." So then, because of this, Lee Christmas and Barney Ross decide to leave the island in their airplane. But one thing I will say, I do like the action scene where Barney Ross is running to the airplane and he escapes the bad guys shooting at him. Plus, the whole scene where Lee Christmas, while in his helicopter, shoots a flare gun at the bad guys on a fishing dock is an epic action scene. And then the main bad guy of the movie, James Monroe, played by Eric Roberts, orders the general to torture his daughter Sandra for information. And 46 minutes into the movie, Gunner, played by Dolph Lundgren, goes into James's office and says, and he basically, because the boss basically says, "What do you know about them?" And Gunner, played by Dolph Lundgren, says, "I used to be a member of the Expendables team." And James asks, "Why did you turn on them?" And then Gunner says, "Lovers quarrel." So we as the audience are under the impression that Gunner betrayed his team, but we'll get back to that. But anyways, not long after that, there is a whole scene where Lee Christmas, his girlfriend who cheated on him, no longer wants to be with the boyfriend she cheated on because he was basically abusing her and stuff like that. And Lee Christmas, played by Jason Statham, says, "Where is he?" And then I like the scene where Lee Christmas, played by Jason Statham, just beats the crap out of his girlfriend's toxic boyfriend who was abusing her. Like, that right there was a pretty cool scene where it happened on a basketball court in front of some people. But then we cut to a scene where Barney Ross, played by Sylvester Stallone, says, "Here's what I think is happening. the guy who calls himself Church is really a front for the CIA. Church hired us to take out the general, but the real target is this guy, James Monroe. He used to be with the agency, but got greedy, went rogue, and teamed up with the general to keep the whole drug operation for themselves. And one thing I will say about the movie, Eric Roberts, he actually does play a rather good villain in this movie, as of course James Monroe. And then now there's actually a bad guy in this movie by the name of Don Payne, who is actually played by the wrestler Stone Cold Steve Austin, who does play a rather good bad guy in the movie. But there's the whole scene where he basically drags the general's daughter Sandra into a room, and we cut to a scene where he drags Sandra into a room and he basically covers her face up with a towel and basically waterboards her for information. And then James Monroe basically says to Sandra, "What did the Americans tell you? Who were they after?" But she refuses to tell them, so James tells them to continue waterboarding her. And one thing I will say, I do like the scene where Barney Ross and Yin Yan, the two characters played by Sylvester Stallone and Dolph Lundgren, are driving a truck. Then they duck as the bad guys fire at them, and after that, Gunner, played by Dolph Lundgren, drives his truck into one of the bad guys, pretending it was an accident. And then the character Yin, played by Jet Li, fires at the truck Gunner is driving, and he, as Gunner basically rammed Barney's truck. And then Gunner accidentally drives into a building, and then the character Yin, played by Jet Li, basically attacks Gunner, because he decides to fight against Gunner because because him and Stallone, they are under the impression that Gunner's a bad guy, but he's really not a bad guy. He's just a good guy pretending to be a bad guy. And it's a very good action scene, but then it stops because Barney Ross basically breaks up the fight with a gun, but he accidentally shoots Gunner. But Gunner ultimately does survive, and he is now officially a part of the Expendables team again. And I will say, another thing I will say, the final 30 minutes of this movie where the Expendables are taking out bad guys is an absolute blast. Then Barney Ross kills two bad guys and rescues Sandra, but bad guys hold Barney Ross captive, and Dan Payne, played by Stone Cold Steve Austin, punches Barney Ross in the chest, torturing him for information. And this is one of my favorite parts of the movie right here, where Dan basically, this is a funny comedic bit that I really like, where Dan basically says to Sylvester Stallone's character, Barney Ross, "Who sent you?" And then Barney Ross says, "Your hairdresser." And then some bad guys. And then not long after that, a group of, the Expendables come to Barney Ross's rescue and fight against the bad guys. And I will say, I do really like the action scene where Hail Caesar, played by Terry Crews, is blasting bad guys to death with a machine gun. That right there is epic. And I gotta say, the final showdown between Barney Ross and James Monroe is epic, where the bad guy James is holding Sandra at gunpoint. Barney drops his weapons as instructed, but the bad guy decides to shoot Barney anyways, and Barney is on the ground. But Barney has a bulletproof vest on, and Barney gets up, and I love the part when James says, "Why did you come for me?" And then Barney says, "I didn't come for you, dip S-word. I came for her." And then not long after that, he and just right after Barney Ross says that, he rapidly shoots James in the chest before James can do anything. And then Lee Christmas throws a knife through James's heart. And I will say, that is an epic villain death. And then the movie ends close to the end of the movie, before Barney Ross leaves the islands, he says to Sandra that he'll be back to see her someday. And then the movie ends where the Expendables are celebrating that they finally defeated the bad guy. And then, of course, the movie ends where, Jason Statham's character, Lee Christmas, is doing target practice. And then the final shot of this movie is him throwing a knife onto a dartboard. And that's how the movie ends. So, yeah, at the end of the day, while this movie is not perfect, I do like this movie. And I do think it is a rather good action movie. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give The Expendables a 9 out of 10. I think that this is a rather good movie. So, yeah. Anyways, guys, that was my review of The Expendables. And, yeah, we will talk to you guys real soon. Bye-bye now.